Welcome to the Perspectives Podcast. My name is Bruce. Thanks for coming back. Or if you're a first-time listener, this is a place for cultural engagement, conversations around different faith perspectives. Today on the podcast, we have a good friend. His name's Jon Pirini. He's from New Zealand, and so you might have an interesting time understanding his accent if you're from the West. Jon's such a great guy, and he's a very creative soul. We had the pleasure of serving together in Ukraine for several years. A theme that I'd like to just explore with Jon, and it's something that we're going through personally, even as a family, is the theme of transitions. We find meaning in rhythm, and so we get used to the flow of autumn, winter, spring, and summer. We have birthdays, different celebrations throughout the year. Even yesterday, watching the kids, the first bell, the time they go back to school, and seeing the little children all dressed up, carrying flowers and chocolates, especially the little girls, you could tell it's opening bell for them over here because they're wearing these huge, beautiful bows, and they're so proud and excited. And the little boys dressed up in, looks like they're going to church. It just made me think of how our rituals and our rhythms really give us a sense of stability. And yet we know, each of us through our life as a narrative, it's being written, has different chapters. Those of us that read, you begin to notice that a good writer transitions into the next one. They don't just finish abruptly. There's a flow. And like our lives as well, when we are coming to the end of a chapter, a season in our life, there are different markers as we age through this life. We begin to recognize a discontent or a stirring. The rhythm that we were in the middle of the chapter was great. We actually think of a Bryan Adams song, Summer of '69. We thought it would last forever, and yet life moves on. And everyone's life is just dynamically moving and changing. And the older you get, the more you recognize, you start to look for the signs that maybe the chapter's coming to an end. Maybe my context is going to change. Maybe there's a decision that's weighing that will ultimately change the direction of my life. And transitions are unsettling because they remove us from those certainties. They're often very challenging because they move us into solitude, into reflection. Before we can move into that next chapter, there's really usually something that God's asking us to surrender, asking us to move into. That can be a difficult space. And others can't go through it with us. You know, we can have listening ears, but it's usually something that we personally are needing to process. As we move through these transitions, the uncertainties increase, the stability decreases, and we find ourselves seeking God, if we're believers, until we can really move into that next season. We need to hear from God. We need to have some assurances about the decisions we're about to make. As we begin to grab hold of some of those certainties, the new certainties, hope arises, and we are excited to see what is going to transpire. Fear gives way to a sense of faith and anticipation. And then the new chapter arises with new rhythms. We need to adapt, maybe to a new space, new friends, new relationships, new job. But thank God he's made us so adaptable, and we want to continue surrendering into the new seasons. And I know Jon, as he shares with us his story, has gone through several as well. He's always been a very creative soul. He's loved music. He's very gifted to see the way that God is working all things together as he moves through life, not straining and striving, but trusting and exploring. He is now seeing some of the investments in his musicianship, as he calls it, and him and his wife, Ruth, they've positioned themselves for a really interesting season now as things come together and they have a school. I hope you enjoy his story, but also are encouraged yourself that these chapters, as they transition, as our life moves from season to season, that this is something that God wants to do with us, wants to do in us. It's not as much of an effort towards getting the right decision and having the most wisdom, but surrender and trust and rest that he's with us and he's working all things together. We ultimately are his prize that he's forming into his image, and through these transitions, they really can be powerful seasons and moments in our life where we discover new dependencies and deeper levels of trust, even if it is uncomfortable and we have to do a lot of adapting. Let's bring in Jon. Mr. Jon Pirini, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, great to be with you, Brett. A real privilege to be part of this conversation.
So Jon and I have known each other for many years. I actually didn't count, but I think it's more than 10.
Yeah, we left Ukraine in 2010, so that's already 12 years.
Well, you're looking better, man. You're aging gracefully.
Thank you. I don't think you've aged a day.
That's very kind of you. Well, we're not here to just give each other compliments. We are wanting to dive into a little bit of your story. Jon and Ruth from New Zealand, tell us where you were born and raised and a little bit about your family.
So, yeah, I'm guessing your audience is mostly North America, and understand that the geography of New Zealand won't be that familiar, but basically two main islands, and I was born in the central North Island. We moved to the very top, and I grew up there in a place called Kaitaia, roughly. Got to the end of my schooling, didn't know what I wanted to do, and fell into teaching, and really loved it, and met my wife in the far north, and then we relocated back to the central North Island on the coast, a place called Tauranga, where I studied my teaching. Roughly there, we got into, with a common passion for Christian camping, we got into youth pastoring in our church and grew in that. And at the time, I got the opportunity to take some of our youth group kids across on a short-term missions trip to Fiji. That really stirred in me a real dissatisfaction with where we were living. Tauranga is kind of like the Bible Belt of New Zealand, if you like. I returned back from Fiji, which is roughly third world kind of situation, to Tauranga and had that culture shock of, even after it was 3 weeks, I think, a year after that we left to go overseas. Ruth's family, she's one of 6 kids. They were scattered all over the place. One sister married a Paraguayan, and so we spent 3 months in South America. And then I arrived in Ukraine and grew a resonance and felt like literally that we had a lot to learn, but also a lot to give. And so God really opened the doors for us to work there as international teachers. Yeah, that's how we arrived in Ukraine, roughly speaking.
What were you teaching during this time? Even from the beginning, what were you trained to teach?
My guidance counselor said, yeah, if you want to do teaching, you want to do it properly, go and study to be a elementary teacher. And so that's what I did. And so when I came to Ukraine, that's what I was trained as, and found jobs teaching rich Ukrainian kids in the English, but a British curriculum.
As you were talking through your story of getting into teaching, I was surprised I didn't hear the word music. You're a really creative, musical guy. When did you know that you were musically inclined?
My journey with music kind of started at elementary school. I saw another girl playing the guitar, and I went home and asked my brother to teach me how to play because I wanted to play for the singing group that she was playing for. You know, it was competitive initially. Music in church was a big part of my development, and I got to play with my family in small church groups. But I didn't really take it that seriously until I was about 15. At high school, playing in school bands, and then when we left school, we kept our school band playing in the local restaurants. And did I know that I wanted to be a musician at that point? I just loved what was happening through music for me. The kind of collegiality or the communication that was happening on a different plane. I know now that I search for in music is that those moments that happen through music that are unplanned and spontaneous.
You arrive in Ukraine. You were always amazing to me because you were there just for a short while, but you picked up the Ukrainian and they so loved speaking with you. I'd watch them come and just enjoy hearing your Ukrainian language. An easy thing for you?
Yeah, so like I said, I was in Paraguay for those 3 months and I got to speak to a conversational level in Spanish within 3 months. Grew up around Maori language, never really got serious about it until I come home. I think musically, right? Music's a language. And so, that's skills that you develop in terms of transcribing what other musicians are doing. I think that's akin to learning language well, is that you're learning how someone says something, and shaping your speech like they do.
I need you to teach me. I've never.
You're a musician, Bruce.
No, I've never looked at language through the lens of maybe emotion and connectivity. It's always so technical, and I didn't like it in school. I didn't like even the English language, let alone learning Ukrainian or Russian. Let's move back to something you just mentioned about Maori, and I know that connects to where you are today back in New Zealand. Can you explain the Indigenous culture there in New Zealand?
So, often people talk about their ethnic mix in terms of their percentage, and I guess I've worked out that I'm roughly a third Maori. Yeah, my Maori identity is a little bit complicated. My journey is that my dad, basically through his Christian teaching, that they told him to put their culture away, all of the imagery and even their language was punished out of them coming through schools in the 50s and 60s. Children are disciplined to not speak Maori. And so the result of all of that was that we grew up with a negative perception of what it meant to be Maori. Mm-hmm. All the while that sort of yearning in your heart to connect with clearly the positive aspects of the culture that you could see around you, mm-hmm. like hospitality and genuine care for others and community and ingenuity, things that are inherent in Maori culture.
Been passed down for generations. I know even in Canada, I think the same experience with the Indigenous, that somehow we thought that Christianity, as it came, through the vehicle of Christendom, the white Europeans failed to distinguish the good news that emancipates and frees, and that is so powerful with the cultural trappings that they were bringing along with them. And so even it seems like the same scenario, even the same timeline as a Canadian myself with the Indigenous and then the Maori, what you're explaining is so powerful, and it's something I think that we need to pay attention to, because these constructs are deconstructing. We must now recognize, particularly those that have the financial power or the mobility or the means, that we did not bring a pure gospel. We brought Jesus, yes, the message, but it was so baked into these power structures, this way of being, this Western, even mental model. And so would it be safe to say that also in the Maori context and culture that they struggle with poverty? Do they struggle with, like in the Indigenous in Canada, with addiction, incarceration, all of the things that come with the world of poverty and being on the margins?
Absolutely. So Maori represent about 16% of the New Zealand population of 5 million people, represented at about 60 to 70% of the negative statistics of incarceration, drug use. So yeah, I would say it's roughly the same kind of numbers in that regard.
In that context of really being shamed for embracing your heritage, that somehow the Western clothing, language, mental models, that they're somehow superior. How did that affect you? At some point, did you begin to just fully embrace another identity, or tell me about that journey? I don't know what that's like.
Yeah, I guess I mentioned my father again because, he was dark-skinned, I'm quite fair-skinned. But people obviously identify me as Maori, so they find it obvious that I am Maori, but I don't try and portray that I speak with a fairly refined kind of accent and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, my father would speak about Maori people in pejorative terms. He would say, "Oh, bloody bludgers, bloody Maoris," trying to take the welfare all the time. And, so I grew up around that, and I didn't feel endeared to embrace Maori culture. So much so that when I was among the culture kind of being taught at schools in the 90s, I shunned wanting to sing in Maori, I didn't want that. I didn't feel an affinity for that. And at the same time, my own father, I remember him sitting in front of the television watching a young man making a speech with very, very eloquent Maori, and him admiring that. So there's those juxtapositions there in my own experience. And so it was definitely kind of complicated, and it has been a process for me, and still is, for me to unpack those feelings of who I am as a Maori person. So, when we talk about proportions, or what proportion are you Maori? Are you fully Maori? Are you not? I am fully Maori, but I'm also fully all the other things that make me up from my mother's side. And incidentally, my mother's family are from Winnipeg, Manitoba. So, the Canadian connection. It's not an easy thing to kind of put your finger on. I guess one of the questions I want to throw back into the mix is the whole popular dogma that we have in education here of decolonization. And I wrestle with that term, because how can you rend one part of yourself from another? It seems so fraught with trouble to unpack that to the point where you can safely say, well, that's from a colonial history and that's from a native or a Indigenous history. It just boggles me that that people think it's such an easy thing to grapple with, and I can't.
I hear you. It's so dynamic, especially as someone like yourself that's traveled and been inside all these different cultures, that culture really is such a powerful influence, and we're being influenced by all the cultures. Every time you watch a movie or you go to visit another country, the influence, whether it's cognitive or not, is shaping your perspective and how you view the world. If you can take us back to Ukraine, you're married, you're teaching, and then there starts to be a sense of transition, because many of us, we go through these, life transitions. Talk me through that process where you eventually came to the point with Ruth to move back.
Yeah, so by the time we had decided to leave Ukraine, we'd been there around 4 years in total, or involved in Ukraine 4 years in total. And it had made a real mark on our hearts. We really loved the people there. I put a lot of effort into learning language to a conversational level, and I really treasure that. It's not something that I take lightly. And obviously the relationships and effort that you put into getting to know people, I really treasure that as well. So it wasn't an easy decision. But what really drove us to thinking about coming home was the whole issue of having kids. And that was a real longing in our hearts. And we'd been trying at that stage for about 8 years and had zero success. Then got a bunch of tests done, tried various kind of sort of DIY over the counter stuff that people tell you, and rah-de-rah. It's an awkward topic, and in some ways I feel privileged to have walked through that, to empathise with others who go through that. We looked at Ukraine at the time as a possibility to navigate medical issues and fertility treatment there, but the corruption that we'd experienced in pretty much every official field that we'd chased, we were confident that it would be riskier proposition to do that in Ukraine than coming home to New Zealand. Yeah, so that was driving us towards at least coming home to navigate that process. We always had in our mind that we wanted to return to Ukraine based on that kind of heart for people that we'd developed there. And even the spot that we'd carved out for ourselves, we felt really, really happy with our home and the community that we were a part of. And I guess going back a couple of years after to visit, we underestimated how much a place can move on in such a short amount of time. The church roughly dissolved in that time that we were part of, and that you were part of. Those relationships were strained, and people who were important to us, and still are now, had moved on to other places, and the void that we left was now filled. And I think that's an interesting thing that we've observed a few times now that we've transitioned a few times in and out of places.
That life really does move on, and I can identify coming back to Texas, after a few years, or even every visit, 15 years in Ukraine, and just not only teenagers, have become adults and have kids, or those that were babies are now greeting you, and not just the physical changes, but also, those relationships. Life is constant dynamic movement. It's interesting how when we leave a place that's important to us and come back to it, like you're mentioning, it can be jarring and even disappointing to see that, wow, that chapter has closed. And so I really identify with you with that sense of closure, maybe, is what I'm trying to say. You sensed that, and then maybe that just affirmed that chapter was over for you.
Yeah, I don't know if we feel like it's over. There's still kind of unfinished business for us. I mean, I guess partly to do with the fact that we still own a house in Ukraine, which is always a wild point to raise with friends or new people that you come across. But yeah, honestly, we still really value the relationships and the life change that happened in us while we were in Ukraine. The growing up that we did there, basically. But also now that we have Gabby, Gabby, thankfully, she was part of, the first round of treatment that we had, fertility treatment, and so blessed that we have her.
And
she's 9.
How old is Gabby now?
Yeah, 9 now, and she'll turn 10 in November. We wanted to have that experience of being in another culture. We think that's so valuable. So, yeah, in many ways we can see ourselves coming back for a stretched time. No promises to anybody, but that's definitely on our hearts, and has been the whole time. I haven't closed the door on Ukraine, and I know Ruth from time to time has said, I really want to be back there. There has been a difference, talking about transition again a bit further though. For both of us, it was a different experience being in Ukraine. I just want to recognize Ruth didn't have an affinity for language. Found the process of putting herself out there and trying language difficult and embarrassing. For me, it was like a big playground and adventure to initiate conversations with strangers and fall over and grow in my language ability. So I grew much quicker in that sense. And so regarding transition, for Ruth, that represented coming back to something far safer. For me, it represented giving something up. But, our experience of Ukraine was different.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to bring our spouses into this conversation, because we're not making these decisions in a vacuum. We're doing them with someone that sees the world differently and has different gifts, different vision. It has to be done together, and I really appreciate how you guys approached that, and how you did, Jon, as a husband too, where you guys really made that decision together. You guys are a team. You are moving through this life together. You didn't seem to be rushing, or I'm quite impulsive, and you guys really seem to be very thoughtful about that. And I'm sure it wasn't easy. I know some of the couples listening to this podcast too, where one is very, let's go, let's buy tickets, let's go move to another country. It's like, slow down there, partner. This is a partnership, and I've appreciated that, about your marriage. And so now you're in New Zealand. You guys were blessed with Gabby, and the next thing I remember is I see some posts, and maybe we talked, but you're going back to school. How did that come about?
Okay. So arrived back in New Zealand in 2010 with the kind of idealism of, hey, we don't need to work 5 days a week. We can work 3 days a week and be very comfortable. We did that, but school has a way. It's kind of a bit of a vacuum. 3 days became 4, and 4 days became 5, and 5 days became all consuming because I was working at a church school, and so I was there 6 days a week. And and I had a lot of freedom in my job and ability to create programs, and I had a good spot. Church went through a pretty horrendous church split. I philosophically wasn't on board with whoever won at the end, and just gave up my job as well, and went on a bit of a journey. And then in the months that I started a jazz group, I've always had this hankering for jazz. Grew up not knowing why, but I grew up listening to guys like Larry Carlton, and obviously has worked through Steely Dan as well as arrangement, George Benson, even James Taylor. I really grew up loving listening to James Taylor. I started a small jazz group, really loved that, and I grew my own musicianship to a point where I knew I couldn't take myself any further. All the while, there was a point where, might have been 2016, where Ruth got ovarian cancer, and we found out that she had stage 4 ovarian cancer, and she went through a real intense chemo regime. It was a very treatable cancer, but very aggressive one. And those sorts of things have a way of sort of changing your perspective as well, or making you reflect on life in a different way. After 6 months of treatment and surgery, we got to the other side of that, maybe 6 months after that, and Ruth said, well, what do you want to do with your life? Well, what do you what's the result of this for you? What's something that you've always wanted to do? You've looked after me really well. I'd just love to see you fulfill something in your life that you haven't done yet. And I said, well, I really want to go to music school. She said, well, let's do it. And so at the time, we owned 2 houses that we'd renovated, and we sold up and moved to the city. It's pretty dramatic. But God really opened the way for us to move from a small hick town to 14 hours drive away in Wellington.
You were in this program for how long?
Yeah, it was a 3-year program. So Gabby was 5 at the time when we moved to Wellington. 3-year program. I was 38 at the time, and studying amongst 20-year-olds who were just killing it. Super competitive boys, and even the girls were ferocious. Mm-hmm. It was a great environment to really test your mettle and learn your chops, and get your butt kicked by all these young people. So I really value that opportunity to really push the boat out and spend 6 hours a day at the time, probably on my own. I was playing anywhere between 2 to 3 hours, really digging deeply into the music field, and like the maths of music and the theory and the history, and even I just had some really cool revelations faith-wise through music as well, which is just awesome to see God's fingerprint in every respect.
Yeah, we could park here and just talk music. I've always appreciated your connection to creative, and as a guitar player, you important in our family. Noah, who was just a small little, maybe was he 2-3 years old, he would come over and watch Jon play acoustic guitar and just stare. And I remember I have some pictures of it. You just stand there and watch. He was mesmerized by this guitar, and now he plays 6 or 7. He can play 6 or 7 hours a day, just electric guitar now. And so how fascinating. I've been studying the limbic system as we're working through kind of trauma therapy, and how powerful from 7 months in the womb, we have these emotional, fully developed emotional components. As creative folks kind of get around and start to enjoy music and creativity, there is something esoteric and something non-cognitive. It's beyond our capacity to measure stuff. We've been unified somehow in this created space. I think music somehow resonates through all of us. And so I love that about you, Jon. Just in our relationship, it's like we kind of connect on a level that doesn't have words. It's kind of cool.
Mm-hmm. Talking with the piano teacher, and he was talking about how Pythagoras figured out that if you play a C note, that built into it, you've got your resonant frequencies, your fundamentals above that. So you've got obviously a C above that, and then a G above that, And he figured all this out ages ago, and then a fourth above that and a third above that. And he worked out basically the chromatic scale based on that realization. And, if you go to a piano, I don't know if you ever try this, but you can push down, like a middle C, and then you can just sort of hold down, but not play the C above it, and then let go of the original C, and it will ring at the top note, at the note that you've kind of held down but not played. And you can do that with a G as well, and you can, because it's singing along. I joined a barbershop chorus during my time in Wellington, and the guy was inducting us, and he said, look, barbershop works based on 4 parts, but really what you're trying to do is harmonize so well that you get ringing. And ringing is the production or the maximizing of the resonant frequency, so that you're not just singing 4 parts, but the whole group working together ends up singing 6 parts or more, and you can literally hear this ringing happening as the voices blend perfectly. And he said, look, I'll show you on my phone. He had a kind of a spectral analysis type of app on his phone. And he said to me, we were in a group of like 10 people, and he said to me, okay, you sing this note. And I sung, and then he harmonized with me, and you could see on his phone the next resonant frequency up from what we were both singing jump up in amplitude. And in that moment, I was like, that's Psalm 133. How good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell together in harmony. Like there's like this Holy Spirit factor that happens, this kind of next level kind of blessing that's put. It's kind of like a law of nature. It's built into things. The sum of the parts is more than what the parts are, 2 people producing 3 sounds. Yeah, so I just was like in awe of creation at that point, just kind of tickling myself with this realization of, God's fingerprint and all of that stuff with resonance, because you mentioned resonance. I didn't realize how much of a creative I was until I kind of walked into a room that was filled with creatives, and I felt kind of strangely at home. Like, oh, these are my people. And so that time in Wellington, I developed quite a network of people who believed in what I brought, and we had a steady stream of work coming in for that, and different projects that people were excited about, dreaming together. And I had phone calls coming through for work up until a year after I moved home. So I grieved that transition because I left that behind, a super creative place with an appetite for live music, and come back to the far north where everybody's playing reggae, which is fine if you're like completely sold out for reggae, not really interested in jazz. But there are those memes on Facebook which says, a jazz musician loads $5,000 worth of gear into a $500 car to get paid $50. I get that. Yeah, I grieved that when I come home, and that sense of disconnection, even though I was moving home to the north, which should represent coming home. So we moved back primarily to be around my mum. She was 75 at the time, and, needing more support since Dad had died about 6 years ago as well. I don't regret that in that sense. It was the right thing to do. But there was definitely a transition in that point too. Ironically, moving back to where I should feel more comfortable and had grown up, Ruth longed for somewhere that was more Maori. That was a real funny realization. When she was in Wellington, she got involved in a softball team, which is kind of like, a scaled back version of your baseball. And she's always loved sports, and that was a really good opportunity for her. And she played amongst, a lot of brown people, Samoans, Maori people. And they go, you're Maori, aren't you, Ruth? No, you're Maori. They adopted her basically. And so coming back to the far north was a return to something that she identified with more. Ironically, down in Wellington, it was far more metropolitan white culture.
Did you feel like you're in a sweet spot now? And can you explain to us what you're doing?
Yeah, so I discovered that passion for teaching way back. I remember kids coming to me at school and wanting to learn, and I really enjoyed that process of sharing what I had. I feel embarrassed about what I was sharing because my rhythm was so bad. I know that now. I realized early on, maybe when I went to study my teaching, that God used my music through my teaching to reach people. I remember a guy looking me up, and there was no agenda to disciple him, but I ended up baptizing him. And that was kind of, not that happened every time at all, but it was kind of what happened as a result of me being involved in music, kind of like a coaching kind of vibe about it. And I guess me going away to study music was tied in with that as well, because I had a definite sense that if I wanted to be the best teacher I could be, I needed to take myself far as I could with my musicianship. And I definitely felt like I really pushed the boat out in that sense, and way more confident in understanding the process of learning, of what it takes to become a thorough and good musician. Like it's these concentric circles that kind of sort of push out from the center, but they overlap further on in the pattern. Teaching and music have always been part of my my game, if you like. And just seeing these kids doing basically a YouTube curriculum, and it just frustrated me. They're showing up at 13 years old, never having touched an instrument, and we expect them somehow to be excellent musicians by the time they leave school. My project is about answering that question. I don't want them showing up at high school never having touched an instrument, particularly if they're gifted with music. I want to find them at 8 and 9 years old and put around them the structure that they need to become a great musician. So by the time they're 13, they're already flying. By the time they leave high school, they're absolutely monsters on their instrument.
So far, you've been doing this for a couple of years now, right?
I got my first contract at a elementary school teaching 8 and 9-year-old, 19-year-olds last August. So, yeah, roughly been in a year now, and I have grown the program to be working at 6 different schools. And I've got someone else on board with me. So it's not massive yet. I think I teach about 150 kids a week.
Wow.
A lot of names to remember, but I am thrilled every week. I'm thrilled by the surprises that I get, the different kids. And I'm teaching stuff that's ultra simple, which is ironic. I've pushed the boat out a long way, and I'm dialing it back to teaching 3-chord songs and single string line picking, or simple drum beats, or simple songs on the keyboard. But even within that, I see myself as like a farmer, and I'm sowing seeds and then taking a harvest of the best ones. In education, I believe we've made excuses for average achievement for way too long. I just want to unapologetically focus on excellence and the people who are talented for a while. Our region, I have a strong belief that the talent we have here is second to none, but the challenge is, we're not getting the instruments into the kids' hands soon enough. And there's some challenges around work ethic and instability of families and ability to pay for lessons and all of that. So I just want to try and problem solve that. That's my mission for the next 10 years. And I'm kind of hoping within that as well that some of the at-risk youth that I'm coming across, and I'm seeing that, the emerging signs of that at 8 and 9 years old, obviously, that I can curb some of that. I can give these guys more of a reason to be engaged, something positive that they can engage with through music. I can sell them on the beauty of playing in an ensemble with somebody else and having that non-verbal communication on that other plane. In short, it's not ultra faith-based, but again, I'm confident that God will use me in that. That's my heart, that's my passion, that's He's birthed in me, that's His fingerprint on my life, and I know that He's alive and well in all those interactions that I'm having with kids.
Yeah, if you were here in my living room, and I was just thinking, as you said, not ultra faith-based, I'd smack you across the head. You know better. And I know that you're bringing your full self, you're caring, you're loving, you're using the instrument as a means and an end. Really get to know these kids and give them value. And what better way to foster or to irrigate, those seeds within them, that they are valued, that they are loved, that they're worthy of respect and honor, and kind of pull them out of some of these mental models. we have that in common, at least with, at Lighthouse. So we bring in these kids from the villages that had never just held a guitar. And I remember the encouragement in my heart. Like I felt like even God saying, just let them hold stuff. And I'm like, if we're going to have a music space, we want nice sounding songs and record cool stuff. And it was like, no, first step is just that they are seen. There's no expectation. They're welcome. They're seen. They're worthy. And you can just see, like, in their minds, the unlocking of some of these ways of thinking. Even if they hold drumsticks, they start to picture themselves, maybe I could be this, maybe I could be. And I love that initial seed sowing phase. Like you're saying, you're working toward a harvest. Man, God is with us in those initial phases. And those of you out there, you don't need to, produce what maybe the world says you need to produce as success. Like just loving someone and just caring is the power of the gospel. I am so looking forward to the next few years as you have this vision to see what God produces. That we know that it'll be exceedingly abundantly above all we could ask or think. And the 100 some students that you're investing in now, the harvest, you'll never see it this side. And I hope you do. But in terms of God's economy, we'll never really truly know. Just to close here, both Ruth and yourself, you guys have any other thoughts and plans? Or are you just locked and loaded for the next 10 years? I was surprised to hear you have a 10-year plan. I don't have a 1-year plan, so I'm jealous.
I don't believe it, man. I reckon that's an unfair evaluation of how it is. I feel like I'm way more happy-go-lucky than you. We kind of make decisions like, just go for it. Yeah, so plans-wise, that's not a 10-year plan. It's really not. I guess looking ahead for the Music Academy, you can look it up. That's Te Hiku Music Academy. It's really not a lot been done on the website, but it's there, and you can see what we're up to. Well, I've put together a business proposal, actually, sent it out to local businesses to try and generate some sponsorship towards buying a music bus. Our region is spread out 2 hours north, east, southwest, and you've got a lot of kids that have this challenge of distance. So I was teaching at the top of New Zealand today, and they are roughly an hour and a half drive at least, if not longer, from the nearest township of 8,000 people. And there's some talented people there. So what I want to try and do is address the challenge of distance by buying a kind of like a 20-seater, taking the seats out, decking it out with like a electric drum kit, a few guitars, keyboards around the sides, a PA.
You're taking the show on the road. It's the inner Jon.
Yeah, rocking up. That's it, rocking up in the fun bus and say, get on board, let's do it.
This is the real vision of Jon. He wants to be a rock star. He wants to tour.
Yeah, not really. I mean, I have done some tour kind of stuff. It was only mediocre and it was fun still. But in terms of like being able to deliver quality music instruction to some of these remote areas, that's really my vision. Because we know the centres are well serviced. We know that they have great facilities, great teachers, great everything, and yet the hinterlands kind of get neglected because it's hard. Yeah, so I kind of want to even see that grow to where we've got, 5 buses and a team of 10 people. I want to get music grads and pay their study through secondary teaching and bond them to be in the area for a little while and grow the music culture up. So that's on the music school front. But on the other front, we've just relocated a house to the top of our sand dune. We bought 7.5 acres of bush-clad sand, and we cleared a building site that looks out to the ocean. And last week we had a 20-ton digger drag our old 1950s house to be renovated up to the top of the hill. So that's going to be busy. I bought myself a 6-ton digger, and I've been learning to drive that. And Ruth's project veggie box subscription. So she's 2 tunnel houses, caterpillar tunnels, I think you might call them in the States.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Come on, man. Growing veggies, man. That's the new world.
Growing what? Veggies.
Vegetables.
Oh, I forgot you speak funny. Vegetables.
Yeah, and the other word that you didn't like from us was fortnight. not just a video game.
Yeah, you used that word before. It was cool.
Yeah, and roster. Remember that? Roster.
If there's anyone out there that is interested in learning more, I'm going to put the links in the description. And I would encourage you to reach out, especially if you're a believer and you have a missional heart, because it sounds like Jon's creating a little base right on this ocean for you to come and plug in and serve and surf. Yeah.
Oh man, yeah, we got access to both coasts. We're 15 minutes from both coasts, so there's never a time where you got no swell.
That's amazing.
Absolutely.
Well,
Shipwreck Bay, if you're interested, check it out.
It's not on my bucket list to come to New Zealand. I just watch Lord of the Rings whenever I get a hankering for the beauty. But, man, that sounds really cool. Once you're all set up and you've got the Airbnb going, let me know. Yeah,
we built a glamping tent out of our own timber that we milled from the site. So we've already got the accommodation there for you, Bruce. It's there.
Okay, sounds good. Well, Jon, thank you so much for joining us. I miss you, and I'm really encouraged to see how God's using you and the different ways our Creator is just emanating through your gifts and your wife. And so may His kingdom keep coming through you all. Well done. So I hope you enjoy Jon's story and are encouraged by the mystery of yourself, the way that you've been made, the way that we are able to interact with one another without words, through music, through just relatedness, that there is an experience happening available to us, even with God, that is not purely mental, purely logical, but a healthy mind, a healthy soul is capable of embracing even the mystery that is life, that is relationship, that is love. And I want to experience more of that through friendships, through relationships. It's so much more refreshing when we're just holding this mystery instead of relishing any sense of certainty that causes us to trust in a relational God and not just a bunch of facts.